So welcome. Thank you to all our attendees. I can see we have quite a number who have already joined in. We want to give it another 2 or 3 minutes and then we can begin. Kindly bear with us.
I like all the people that logged in with just their first name. It's like, okay, I know a bunch of people with that first name. I'm wondering which one it is. Adrian, if that's you, hi. All right.
Jess, I don't know if you're talking to us, but you are on mute.
Oh, sorry. Here I am. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for joining our conversation on EOR Insights. We are pretty excited as WorkPay to host this conversation. My name is Jess Wanjohi. I'm the marketing manager at WorkPay. I'm excited that you've put together a really great panel to really unpack what compliance means and what it is and its importance within the African landscape for both employers and employees. And we're excited to engage with you to understand what your experiences has been with EOR. And please don't worry if you've not had any chance to interact with EOR before. I think this is a good time to get to also understand what EOR is broadly. We've put together quite a rich panel, and I'm happy that they will be introduced by our moderator today, who is Boris, Vice President of Operations. But before we dig in and get into the deep dive of this conversation, I just wanted to share with you a few pointers about expectations and some of the things that you'll be doing within this webinar. One, this webinar is being recorded and we are also live on YouTube. Please feel free to engage with us. We are pushing 2 hashtags, EOR Insights and WorkPay Webinar on our social media channels. Feel free to tag us if you have any insights that you feel you'd want the world to know about what you've learned today. We will be availing the recording to each and every person who has attended, so that if you're able to share it with somebody else, then they don't get to miss out on this conversation. And I think lastly, we will be running some polls in between the webinar and at the end of the webinar. Again, your feedback about both the conversation and the experience generally about what you have had with EOR as an employer or as an employee. I would love to hear that from you. But allow me to now take it back to our speakers in the interest of time, which will be led by Boris. He's a very able Vice President of Operations. He handles everything from processes, and he's very well versed with what we do as an employer of record services provider within most African countries in Africa. And he's going to steer the conversation between Jeff and Catherine. I've seen Catherine has joined, and Tracy, who is our legal counsel, part of our legal counsel here. Let him introduce them. Thank you very much for your time. We look forward to your engagement. Our Q&A session remains open throughout this webinar. Feel free to type in your questions at any point. The moderator will be on the lookout and have them answered, whether in between the conversation or at the end. Stay tuned, and thank you for joining us. Over to you, Boris.
Great, thank you, Jess. Thank you, all the attendees. I think we're coming up on 50 or so now. So thanks for joining us on what I imagine for many is afternoon, evening, but I suspect we have people from all over the world. We appreciate it. I know Jess tries to organize one of these WorkPay webinars at least once a quarter. We seem to be doing more and more of them. They are often very informative. I regularly join as a guest. But pleased to be invited to moderate today. My role at WorkPay as Vice President of Operations is indeed to oversee all operational teams on the continent, both for our software as a service business and our EOR service business. That includes payroll operations, it includes people operations, customer operations, and legal operations. And I'm pleased to be joined today. We've had a kind of shuffling of panelists due to personal conflicts and natural disasters. Raj may join us at the end, but our primary panelists today are here, and we're very glad to have them. My esteemed colleague, Tracy Kinoti, our Senior Legal and Compliance Executive at WorkPay, who handles all matters legal compliance when it comes to EOR, from immigration to licensing to employment contracts, tax compliance, you name it. She's an advocate of the High Court and Commissioner for Oaths in Kenya, with many years of experience previously in the litigation space, practicing civil and employment labor law before joining the much more exciting tech space as one of our in-house counsel here at WorkPay. And she is also joined by Jeffrey Olson, who manages strategic partnerships at TopSource worldwide. He has served in international space for 10 years, providing corporate tax, entity establishment, and related support, as well as employer of record services. So we have kind of the sales, business, partnership side of things, as well as the more nitty-gritty legal side of things. So I think it's a great combination. Catherine has joined, I think I'll say in backup. So Catherine Ochako is our head of EOR, Senior Manager for EOR Business Development across Africa. So anyone who is here considering engaging in an EOR relationship with WorkPay or anyone else should reach out to Catherine. She has the broadest perspective. So I'm sure she'll chime in here and there, but I think Tracy and Jeffrey will take the lion's share of the questions, given the focus specifically on compliance. So thank you, panelists. Thanks, Jess, for organizing this, and thank you for all attendees for joining us. The topic is a really critical one. As I say, I oversee all operations related to EOR. But when I'm not on the business development or the sales side, but when I try to define kind of the value of EOR as a service, I generally sum it up as providing savings to our clients. And it saves you in 4 ways: money, time, hassle, and risk. If you engage in an EOR contract, you're protecting yourself from big capital expenditures, lots of time trying to make sure you are compliant, lots of hassle, probably getting it wrong, and a great deal of risk that comes with getting it wrong. And so I'd say we're here to kind of like unpack that. Like, what does that risk look like? What are the various ways one can mitigate that risk, inclusive of EOR? I think is perhaps the most effective and most comprehensive way to mitigate that. But we'll explore all avenues, certainly. Just how we're going to break this down. Now we've got a little less than an hour and a half, but we'll do a little less than a 1 hour discussion, maybe like 45 minutes or so. We'll have at least 15 minutes to follow of Q&A. And then there'll be some interactive polling, and we'll kind of loop back on some discussion around the polls and the responses we get there. Yeah, so without further ado, I'll jump into it. I'll just open up with a kind of broad question that I can address to both panelists, but maybe starting with you, Tracy. What are the common, I've mentioned risk broadly, employing remote teams in Africa comes with risk. That's the premise of this conversation. What are the most common compliance challenges that you think companies face when they're managing remote teams in Africa? And then if you'd like, maybe we can get into kind of like what are the key typical like legal frameworks that govern those challenges that people might find themselves potentially running afoul of and needing to be aware of as they enter a country and are hiring up, spinning up a remote team in Africa.
Right. Thanks, Boris, and welcome everyone to this webinar. So when you mention employer, anytime you see the word employer, of course, we have to underscore the labor laws that govern this regulation. So we have things like labor laws across the continent that regulate working hours, they regulate benefits, termination procedures, and employee rights. So that is the fundamental principle that governs EOR, and that ensures that we remain compliant as long as we are able to look back on this labor law. So for example, in South Africa, we have the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. In Kenya, we have the Employment Act of 2007. Of course, this runs across the whole continent. So the first thing that we need to discuss here are the labor laws. Something else that really comes into play when you talk about EOR are the tax regulations. So every country has different tax regulations, and tax compliance is extremely crucial. We know that two things in life are certain, that is death and taxes. So taxes are very, very important to consider when we discuss matters EOR. So when you talk about the obligations of employing remote workers in different countries, we talk about income tax, talk about social security contributions, and corporate taxes. Now, some of the risks that arise with employment, with EOR and employment of remote workers is things like permanent establishment. So in countries like Nigeria, once you surpass the 183 days, then you establish permanent establishment in the host country, which subjects you to the company to local and corporate taxes, as well as employee taxation, where we have to keep ensuring that we have employer contributions and employee contributions being done well. Something else that is still coming up in the continent and remains to grow is data protection and privacy. With remote work, of course, that arises, and we're trying to actually set up as WorkPay our different compliance with data protection and privacy within the continent. Places like Eswatini have a deadline of September, so we have to rush and make sure that that is covered. So when we speak about EOR, those are the fundamental principles governing EOR. So I think I'll throw it to Jeff to kind of see what he can tie into that.
That's a lot.
Yep.
So I think you covered a lot of ground very succinctly. So thank you for that. The other thing that companies are going to want to, from a client and company perspective, I think the thought process is, where's my risk and how do I assess what that risk is? And one of the basic premises of that is going to come back down to your basic HR premise of employee versus contractor, and whether or not you're assessing what these candidates or employees are going to be doing. Are they truly a contractor, or are they actually an employee masquerading as a contractor? And therefore you're assimilating a bunch of risk and possible exposure as you move through that relationship. So it's a pretty standard assessment. It does vary country by country. So you can come back to us and we can talk through some of the bullet points on that. But I think that's where the rubber hits the road for a lot of companies, is assessing, how do I enter? Is employer of record going to, address these compliance risks? And the short version is that it does, because what you're doing is you're onboarding these people as employees as opposed to paying them as freelance contractors when they're truly not. Tracy, does that make sense? Did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah.
So then when you talk about the contracts versus independent contractors, we have to make sure that we strike the balance between, which is a very sensitive balance between employment contracts and independent contractors, because we have different ways in which employers can contract or employ their employers or contractors. So we have employees, and independent contractors, which we're able to manage because both have very different nuances to them. So those are things that we're able to balance in terms of being able to support with that in the context of EOR.
Yeah, on a global basis, if this individual is working solely for you, they are using your email address, their mandatory attendance of meetings, they're getting paid the same thing every month, every week. If they're being operationally treated as an employee, then they're an employee, regardless of whether you pay them as a contractor or not. And that's one of the risk assessments that the client needs to be very aware of as they move through. The other things are, things like, benefits, providing benefits, having benefit parity across an organization, and, in short, taking care of your people. So if they do run afoul, that they have access to the, statutory benefits at bare minimum, so that they can take care of themselves and their family. So those are other things to talk about as you go through and assess, not only the compliance risk, but, the employee experience risk, so to speak, because the upshot of all of this is to make sure two things: that the client is compliant and has the ability to do what they need to do in country, but also that the employee is whole. The employee has the benefits that they need. The employee has the ability to make contributions to their pension scheme or their benefit scheme or whatnot, and they're not out in the cold, in an adverse situation. Tracy?
Yeah, something else that I think I can bring out is African countries have diverse labor laws. So a lot of it has to make sure that you are actually employing whatever is in that particular country. I know sometimes our clients want us to include their internal policies and the internal procedures into our contract, but we have to make sure that those are actually in tandem with the local labor laws, and also ensuring that some of these countries you actually have to have the dual employment contracts registered with the authorities. So countries like Francophone countries, you have to have the English and French contracts done, the dual contracts. So those are things that you have to ensure that even as so that the English version of the contracts match the different language. For example, if it's French for Francophone countries like Angola, we have English and Portuguese contracts done. So we have to ensure that those actually match the various and are captured within the various jurisdictions in the continent.
Right. And then something to understand for our English and non-French, Portuguese speaking folk is the language of enforcement is typically the French and the Portuguese and not the English translation. So what you see in the English translation is not always what you get. So you need to be careful not to make assumptions there from a compliance situation, and make sure you come back to your resources, us, and ask the right questions before you go talk to the employee, or before you start instigating or installing policy. Right. So just things to think about.
Yeah, that's something we've encountered. Sorry, go ahead, Tracy.
Thanks, Boris. I'm saying something else we also need to factor in is the tax compliance in terms of how some people want their taxes done. So some people want a stipend paid into the country in which they're working, and then have the net paid into their home country. So what does that look like in terms of taxation? What risks come up from that, and how is that managed?
Yeah. I was just going to add on the language side. I mean, we've had an experience, to your point of enforcement, Jeffrey, where we were working in West Africa. A new West African country for the first time. We created an English language contract that we thought was compliant, had it translated by a third party, a professional translator, to French, later had a Francophone employee tell us that it was sort of a garbage translation. It didn't make any sense. We then had that internally translated with French-speaking employees we'd subsequently hired, who said, actually, it seems fine. So for those of us who are kind of senior decision makers who weren't bilingual in this case, namely myself, it was a very difficult kind of judgment call to know where to go, because we had multiple qualified translators and native speakers giving us very different views on the language. So yeah, it's extremely tricky. And it's that experience has led us to bolster our internal linguistics, I'll say. On that same topic, Tracy, you mentioned labor laws, employment, and then tax being critical, and then permanent establishment. In Kenya, typically, from my experience, the labor laws are in the Employment Act. The tax compliance matters come from the Finance Act. And the permanent establishment and directorship and setting up entities comes from the Companies Act, which are refreshed almost annually. Is that a Kenyan kind of paradigm and structure? Is that a Commonwealth law structure, or or do you find that everywhere? You mentioned kind of diverse legal structures across the continent. So just wondering if people should kind of look for specifically named acts or statutes as they kind of explore these topics.
Yes, actually, yeah, because of course those are that is where all these things are kind of like housed. So we have different laws for different regions, as I mentioned earlier. So you'll find even in terms of the statutory contributions, the tax obligations cut across different markets and multiple jurisdictions within the continent. So we kind of have to sit and now comb through those different regulations. So different countries have different regulations in terms of, for example, East Africa, you'll find some of them being more common than Francophone countries. And then when we get into North Africa, that's a whole different dispensation on its own. So we just kind of try to figure out how we can merge this. And that's why it's very important for us to stay on top of the different regulations and to keep abreast with all these constantly evolving changes within the markets. I hope
I'll take this question so she doesn't have to lawyer in places she doesn't want to lawyer. From a permanent establishment perspective, PE is going to be determined by the country. The broad scope of what permanent establishment means is pretty global, but how it's actually applied and interpreted is very much a country by country thing. So, you know, the levers, the enforceability, et cetera, they're very much jurisdictional. And, you know, for those of you, permanent establishment being, you know, when you're in a country long enough to be determined by the authorities, by the government, the local government, that you need to set up a formal legal structure of your own in your own company's name, right? Because you've tripped certain triggers, be they, you know, tax, legal, your biz ops, HR, combinations thereof. But yeah, it's definitely something to keep on our radar, but it's actually one of the things that EOR mitigates very well, because you're actively employing your headcounts on entities in good standing in the country of choice so that your employees are compliant. And then, you know, the rest of it is kind of what you're doing in the country as you move forward. Tracy, I mess anything up there?
Good, you're good.
Yeah.
Great. Well, you mentioned EOR as you know, a mitigating approach. I want to get there. Maybe just one last question for Tracy. These constant changes, how do you or how might other companies maybe who are not utilizing EOR services, how did they handle these fairly constant and often unexpected or unannounced changes to labor laws, tax laws, company law, and the rest in, you know, the 54 different countries that we're talking about?
All right, yeah, I'll begin by saying this is usually more of a collaborative approach, very proactive and collaborative approach, where you have to, it involves a lot of regular monitoring. So you have to stay informed, where companies should closely monitor regulatory updates in all the jurisdictions, of course. So we're talking labor laws, tax jurisdictions, data protection requirements in all these African countries. And something else that has worked for us and we highly recommend is just partnering and getting legal expertise in all these markets, so either partnering with local legal counsel or companies that kind of just assist with monitoring of these changes. Something else I would say is also just making agile policies where you're able to quickly adapt to these new laws and these new changes, and all these regulatory frameworks that are constantly being changed within by the different countries. For example, Mozambique just enacted or just brought out the new labor laws, I think 2 months ago. So those are things that you need to get into, research on, regular monitoring, and of course subscribing to things like newsletters from those countries. So it has to be a very collaborative and a proactive approach. Yeah, makes sense.
And then, Jeff, what would you say? I mean, you got into EOR as certainly, I think we'd all agree, is a best practice for ensuring compliance for your remote teams. But what else would you recommend that our attendees consider as best practices for ensuring compliance and mitigating the risks that you guys have elaborated?
I guess it's taking a look at how you're intending to do business in a jurisdiction and where your best entry point is, and coming into it with the end in mind, right? And looking at the entire entity and employee life cycle of your intended engagement in that country and planning from that respect. You may use employer of record for market entry or for opportunistic hire as you come in And, at some point you may have a trigger there, and knowing what that trigger is, whether it's permanent establishment or a financial trigger or an HR trigger, a client that wants to contract with you directly in that jurisdiction, knowing what all of these triggers and compliance hurdles are from the beginning and mapping those out, keep the business from running into undue surprises and snags from a compliance and operational perspective. Boris, does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps maybe this now open question to the both of you. Can you guys think of examples either that you've dealt with yourself in the course of your career, or perhaps case studies you've seen in the news or through colleagues, but examples of legal issues that you've observed or challenges companies have faced and how they've run afoul of these risks and these legal frameworks, or how they perhaps applied some of the mitigating factors successfully to overcome those?
The first kind of case study that comes to mind is from a client perspective on this one, which is this particular client was in the middle of an exit. They had been made an offer to be acquired, and they were going through diligence, and come to find out that certain members of their senior executive team were still engaged as contractors in jurisdictions. And so that stalled the acquisition process and complicated the transaction, and ended up costing the seller a significant amount of money for two reasons: that the buyer did not want to assume that risk, and also the market changed in the time that it took them to reassess diligence and take a look at what the risk was. The market changed, so the seller was no longer willing to pay what they were willing to pay initially. So what EOR does in that situation is mitigate that risk from the beginning, so that your employees are compliant, they're diligence ready, so that when you get into a transaction, you're not all of a sudden, stumbling around trying to backfill. So that's one of the most, kind of painful, because his acquisition went from 50 million to 25 million for a bunch of reasons. So it cost a significant amount of money, and it also highly influenced the employee experience around the company, because they were in limbo for a while, not sure what they were doing, etc. So it caused a huge mess across the company, both for the employees and for the seller, and for the buyer too, because it gave them heartburn.
Wow, you don't often make a $25 million mistake, but that is one there.
You'd be surprised. I mean, ultimately, let's be real. Ultimately, when you're on an exit, if you're getting acquired, it's a capitalistic transaction. I'm going to give you $25 million less purely because I can. I found a chink in your armor, and in my opinion, I'm assimilating a bunch of risk. Whether or not that's true doesn't matter, because he or she who holds the gold makes the rules. I mean, to a lot of extent, especially in an acquisition environment, right? The buyer, dictates,
Right.
So.
All right. That's a great case study. Tracy, any examples you can think of
Yes.
where people have either failed or been successful in kind of mitigating these risks?
Yeah, so I'll give a brief one about a time where there was a wrongful termination for an EOR employee, and the EOR service provider almost got entangled in this legal battle within the Kenyan courts. So what happened was they didn't follow due procedures they should have as per the employment contract. That's why it's very, very important to have these aspects laid out very clearly for the employees, and as well as for the employers to understand. And so what we advise is, when people use EOR, we advise them that we will do the legal, we'll do the payroll benefits, we will not give you any advisory, but we still need you to manage and help us manage collaboratively the day-to-day tasks, looking at the job responsibilities and the duties, keeping good documentation in terms of also bringing into place policies that have monitoring and enforcement of remote work policies. Then that way you're able to enhance this with proper documentation. And when it comes to time for it to either be terminated or resignation, we have kind of those clear lines, as opposed to having bloodlines around that, because that can really give rise to very long and nasty legal battle. So that was a case of, this was a termination procedure that was done wrongfully and unlawfully. And yeah, the employee ended up being paid out. So those are the risks that we need to look at. And those are the nuances within the EOR broader spectrum.
But those are good pros and cons for, you know, both sides of the fence, so to speak, right? The client is hiring an employee, and therefore via employer of record, you know, they're obligated via an employment agreement, right? Which means the employee is also protected in the employer of record scenario as well. So they're no longer being treated as a contractor and, you know, intrinsically expendable based on local law, et cetera. But, you know, so that's a great case study of, yeah, it was muddy and there was work and there was a legal battle, but the employee got what they deserved because of the way it was managed and handled. And without an employer of record situation and without an employment agreement in place, that employee likely would have had no case. You know, so it's a good case study on both sides. You know, it's not something the client likes to hear, but, you know, from an employee perspective, it's nice to know that you have, you know, you have recourse and you have, you know, some protections there.
Yeah, maybe just to dig in on wrongful termination a little bit, because I'd say it's one of the ones that keeps me up the most at night. Tracy, perhaps you can kind of explain, because you mentioned labor laws, and I think that falls under the labor law category. But like, what are the requirements look like? I know you can't speak to every African country, but maybe just Kenya and the Commonwealth countries to start there. Like, what are the termination options that people could run afoul of? And I ask that because I am from the U.S. originally, and the African legal frameworks tend to follow more of the European tradition, which are more favorable to the employee than the employer. So we find that when we have American clients, they are often quick to want to make terminations at certain points, often for good reason, and then are surprised by the requirements they encounter here that are protective of the employers, and that we as the EOR provider who hold the contract with that employee are obligated to. So would you maybe just from a high level talk about that a little bit, Tracy?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Boris. So when we speak termination, we have termination in itself where the notice periods are embedded in the employment contract, right? But we also have other options where employers and employees have reconcilable differences, and there's been gross misconduct or misconduct or lack thereof, and now they decide to do a summary dismissal. Now, the thing with termination, let me begin by discussing termination. So for termination, every contract must have a termination notice period, either during a probationary period or in the course of the employment after confirmation, which is after the probationary period, where an employer, so for Kenya, for example, it's a minimum one month notice. In different regions, it depends on the number of years you've served. So for example, you have an employee who's been there from 1 to maybe 3 years is 1 month, from 3 to 5 years, it would probably be 2 months, and then so forth and so on. And so that needs to be followed. Where an employee and an employer agree, of course, the termination could be done, and either in pay of leave of notice, or the employee could surrender their pay. That's, of course, some flexibility then, which, of course, it involves a lot of internal discussions as long as the period in itself is observed. And then we have summary dismissal, which is kind of where rubber meets the road. So for this, you have to make sure that procedure has been followed. So you have to actually come and prove that you have either given these employees warning letters, you have called them to meetings, after which then you can give them have a disciplinary meeting, and then of course terminate them summarily and give them the severance pay if there's any. But for most cases, there's no severance pay that is tied to things like summary dismissal. This is more towards the termination side, right? And then we have, of course, resignation, which are ways that people can terminate their relationship, employer-employee relationship. We also have redundancy. We've done a redundancy for one of our strategic clients in Uganda, and it was very procedural. You had to follow the law, and I know in markets like Uganda, you had to have a reason even to terminate an employer. That has since been revised through a landmark ruling towards late last year, but that has been the case. In Uganda, you literally could not dismiss an employer without any reason. So it could either be related to their conduct, misconduct, or whatever, but that had to be encapsulated there. So yeah, so those are the main ones I can think of top of my head, and those are the nuances that come with these things. Of course, now when which we're seeing coming up with a lot of our EOR employees and clients, is things like what documents do we get upon terminating or upon offboarding. We have certificates of service that we can issue. We give you your package and give you a breakdown. For example, your paid leave on notice, your unpaid time off, which is your right to receive at the end of your contract or upon termination. We have things like severance pay if relevant. So those are the kind of aspects that we have in terms of termination. Of course, I've really summarized it because I could go on and on about the different procedures we have for, I think I would say our 30 or so markets based on our footprint, but I've just tried to summarize it across what's shared, what's mutual for the jurisdictions that we have dealt with so far.
And this is where the rubber hits the road for EOR for all parties, right? Separation, termination, exit, whatever you want to call it, when the employee and the clients and the employer of record separate. This is what I meant by where you plan with the end in mind. And this is one of the benefits for the client and for the employee of EOR, because as you're entering the relationship, you have a documented employment agreement. You know what the rules of the road are. They've already been mapped out. You know what your probationary periods are. You know what your responsibilities are, et cetera. And then it's enforcement of that employment agreement on the backside that's critical. And I've seen case studies in other operations where, those employment agreements were ruled, less than, and it became muddy. So you have to make sure that you understand what you're dealing with as a client. The employer of record has to understand what they're dealing with as a provider and make sure that those agreements, are not only locally compliant, but they're also managed properly. And so this is where the client can come to the employer of record, whether it's, WorkPay or TopSource or whoever you're dealing with, and speak with your representation, speak with your employment attorney, speak with your client success manager, speak with your people as a client before you start going to the employee and, pardon me, running your mouth, because you may be saying things and doing things that are going to put you into that wrongful termination situation, or you're creating a hostile work environment, or you're just looking dumb because you're saying things that are not locally compliant and the employee knows this, right? So it's making sure that you're utilizing the team that you have with employer of record appropriately, right? And that's going to save you a lot of hassle and time, employee management, and there's also things like, that are not termination related from a compliance standpoint that come up, like, maternity, paternity, caregiver leave, or, things like that, time off, right? PTO requests, things like that. What's compliant? What am I allowed to do? Because from an American perspective, Americans, me being one, have a propensity to say, okay, you're going to get like 2 weeks of vacation a year, and that's the way it is. Well, you know what? In a lot of jurisdictions, that's not the case. You get 2, 3, 4 weeks a year, or you get, that's tiered. So you have to understand what you're getting at from a compliance perspective and make sure you enforce it properly. So,
yeah. And that's how we try to mitigate risks internally. For example, we ensure that during any disciplinary hearings or any offboardings, we have the legal team from WorkPay. We try to get our HR tool to sit in those meetings. We also get their HR to sit in those meetings as well, just to ensure that we're all on the same page. Yeah, so those are ways that we try to mitigate those risks because it's very crucial.
Great. Thank you. Let's move. We've talked a lot about the current status, the current risks, and the current strategies to mitigate those risks when hiring remote teams in Africa. Look towards the future a little bit. And again, I'll kind of just pose a big question. You can both tackle it from your different perspectives. But what do you foresee as the most significant changes, regulatory changes that you anticipate in Africa that's going to impact this question of hiring remote teams in the coming years? And then how do you see the role of EOR or other, legal and compliance strategies evolving in response to those regulatory changes?
Tracy, you want to go first?
Unanimous.
Yeah. So what I can see for now, I would say, is that and what we're seeing growing is things like incorporating, because of the digitization of all these tools. So we're seeing ourselves moving to a digitized era or space. For example, I'll talk about tax compliance. And I know Boris is aware of this, of how much, for example, for the Western side, it really takes a lot to be able to ensure that our employees, of course, they're compliant, but it takes quite a bit. This is because this is still a very manual process that's done out there. And so with the digitization and automation of a lot of systems and government offices, I think we're going to see a lot of up-to-date compliance, filing of statutories and up-to-date filing, and as well as being able to access records easier, which has been remained a pain point for most countries within the region. So I see that being one of the main things that will come into force. Something else I would briefly, of course, mention is AI. There's going to be automation of a lot of things in terms of monitoring of remote work, policies, policy making, streamlining of tasks, regulatory compliance. We're going to be able to do quite some stuff with that. So those are things I can kind of foresee. Yeah.
And then from a regulatory perspective, there's also just like, the entity and employee life cycle, like we talked about. What's going to happen as I see in the future of EOR, what it does is it opens the door for a lot of businesses to enter markets where they hadn't traditionally been able to enter before. So there's an uptick in people hiring local nationals. There's an uptick of business in general. And then there's the government catching up with that and realizing that there's an expanding market. So there's a regulatory push and pull there, Tracy, that I think you see in countries as well, where it's like, oh, we don't care about that. Okay, wait, we do. Because now it's trying to blossom in that country, because EOR is allowing these companies to come in and explore markets and do things that they couldn't normally do before, or they were doing under the radar. They were doing as contractors, they were doing in a less than compliant fashion. Now the governments are actually seeing more revenue, they're seeing more compliance, and when you see that trend, governments have a tendency to react and start to adjust and start to say, okay, we want a bigger piece of the pie here, or we want to install a regulation here because now this is becoming a challenge that needs to be addressed, etc. So, and you'll see that in Europe, you see that in LATAM, you also see that in Africa, whereas, employer of record services start to grow and become more predominant, then there becomes a regulatory, adjustment as well in that country. So you have to kind of be aware that it's, EOR is a fantastic tool, but it's not the panacea, right? It's not the be all end all of everything. And the client still has to, remain aware of their environment and their risks, et cetera, and lean on their employer of record provider to keep them compliant, but also to understand that, there's tipping points in there, right? And then understanding kind of like what that is too, because employer of record from a compliance and regulatory and just sheer business opportunity standpoint is a fantastic tool. But like I said earlier, there comes a point in time where you may get to a point where you have permanent establishment, or you have a client that wants you to sign with you in country as opposed to the employer of record, or you have employees that require certain regulatory licensing that they didn't before, that require that, and Tracy, maybe you can talk to that a little bit, because there's certain barriers to, regulatory compliance, where if you need a financial services license because you're rendering, financial services in a country, sometimes that license has to be very specific. So as your business grows, you're going to run into regulatory compliance issues on a broad scale. So it's a lot of stuff, but Tracy, you understand where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I can see a lot of also that ties to like policy influence. We're going to have to see advocacy efforts to try and just regulate different reforms, kind of just trying to change the different reforms within the regions, as well as tie them together, because something else that will arise out of this is cross-border considerations. So there'll have to be a lot of sharing and also adapting of different laws and regulations from different markets, seeing if they can be synchronized into one meeting that people can kind of access without having to use different tools here and there. So yeah, I see that.
With one of a hot topic in Kenya at the moment in the tech space where we operate as WorkPay has been a new, they're calling it like a gatekeeper law, where basically saying IT practitioners as yet to be defined, but presumably defined more broadly than just programmers, will have to be certified by the government, almost in the way that a doctor.
Boris, did we lose you? Tracy, you still there?
Yeah, still here.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I
what
think
we're going to talk about is just legislative developments, that this is things that are going to be cropping up. We're going to see different developments from different industry trends that are going to be kind of like tied together with different legislatives that will be arising. So I think that's what Boris was trying to get at. Anything to say, Jeff? Anything?
yeah, the regulatory compliance landscape is complex, and it's something that, you know, we have to be careful of because there's some legal boundaries that we're going to tap dance around here. But the reality is that, you know, there's a lot of regulatory compliance landscape that needs to be properly managed in concert with your employer of record, right? So EOR is a great tool to kind of insert, like I said, it's used to hire employees in a locally compliant fashion and build a market in that jurisdiction. But at some point, you're going to run into regulatory compliance hurdles that either evolve as the government evolves, or you trigger as you move through your business cycle, right? And understanding what those are as they boil down to the employment agreement, and they also boil down to your engagement contract with WorkPay or your provider. Understanding what the rules of the road are there is important from a client perspective a lot. And that's what I meant by understanding what you're getting into with the end in mind. Because yeah, you know, there's ways this evolves, and at some point, you know, there's transitions that need to happen, and that's something that you need to understand when you come into this environment. Is, you know, Tracy, are there limits in Africa for, you know, EOR terms like there are in Europe and LATAM? You know, are there engagement limits for 18 months or 2 years or whatever, to where there's a trigger there where you have to reassess? Is that a thing in Africa? I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
So do you mean in terms of like definite versus indefinite contracts or engagements?
I'm speaking in terms of, like, you know, for example, Germany's AUG regulation, where you can only be on an employer of record platform for like 18 months, and then you age out and you have to make some sort of next step. Is that a thing in Africa? I actually don't know the answer to that question.
Not yet, because remember, EOR in Africa is fairly new. It's completely unregulated. So we're probably going to be the ones to trailblaze and chart those paths. But for now, it remains completely unregulated. We're able to at least have the flexibility of having them for as long as. So we're still trying to monitor how that's going to look with the different governments. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's in the long term. That's coming back to that compliance kind of evolution. You know, hopefully that doesn't happen sooner than later, but you know that's going to come down the pipe in some places at some point. And having the right provider to do that, and having the provider understand what the rules of the road are in that jurisdiction, and enforcing the employment law and making sure that you're compliantly, you know, taken care of, is going to mitigate a lot of that risk and keep you from tipping those triggers sooner than you like. Not the most articulate way to put that, but that's the reality.
Agreed.
Boris, are you back? You were back and now you're not back. So, you know, have we, Tracy, have we spoken to, you know, kind of the understanding of, you know, EOR services and the importance from a kind of a tactical, more, you know, EOR presentation perspective? I don't think we've done that yet.
Maybe I can give Catherine the chance to be able to help address that.
Catherine?
Hi guys, I hope I'm reconnecting successfully here. Apologies, my internet seems to have dropped.
You're all right. Yeah, we worked through your question, and we are now moving forward into section 4, basically.
Great.
So we were just handing that over to Catherine to kind of jump in and opine on, or maybe not, because she just went away. But
She didn't like
I
that
mean,
question.
right?
Maybe you
Run
want to
away.
pick it up, Jeff?
Yeah, sure. So, from a very kind of sophomore perspective, employer of record is here for the client to onboard and compliantly employ and pay their headcount in these jurisdictions. So what happens is, you know, the employer of record acts as the legal employer in a jurisdiction where the client doesn't have a legal entity and therefore doesn't have the legal ability to employ people. It's a fantastic tool because as an employee, as a resident of an African country, I now have a tool where I can be compliantly employed by a global company that doesn't yet have a presence in my country, right? And be the tip of the spear with this company and help instigate change and create a market and, you know, do social good and, you know, actually make a difference without waiting for them to having to assess, do I want to spin up an entity? What's the cost and the risk of that? If it doesn't work out, then I have to unwind the entity, which, fun fact, setting up an entity is a lot like getting married, and unwinding an entity is a lot like getting a divorce. They're like, sure, come on down, set up an entity. Wait, you want to leave? You know, hold on. So there's an unwinding process there for the client that is, you know, abbreviated by the employer of record model. There's a lot of benefits to that from a client perspective and from an employee perspective. And then what it does is allow them to exploit the market from a compliant fashion, and then really kind of land and expand from there. Tracy, did you want to jump in and add anything there? Catherine, you're back. So we covered the basics of EOR, just basically did the broad definition of what it is and how it applies. Did you want to opine on any of the services or importance of EOR? Catherine?
Hi everybody. Yes, Boris, you wanted to go first?
No, just making sure you could hear us. Go ahead. Thanks.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. Now, one of the things that I have discovered what EOR does for companies is basically optimize the structures that most companies are running out here. Most companies, especially in our region, have gotten or are realizing remote working, and it's increasingly becoming a thing in the African region. And so having an EOR provider or an employer on record provider is one of the very important things that helps optimize the operations in that sense. So I would say being discovered, I would say in Africa, it's something that is being discovered. And I'm glad that we are at the forefront to just make sure that we are spreading that gospel and ensuring that we are speaking about it and we are channeling it and making it, we are sort of the sounding board, and we're making the loudest noises about how important it is for companies to embrace this and to continue using it. Because basically, in a nutshell, for people who haven't interacted with it before, it's in a bigger form, just selling compliance. I mean, so compliance is the most important thing in the employer of record space, and I'm glad we're having that conversation today. Back to you, Boris. I'm glad to see you back, and I'm sorry about that internet glitch.
No worries. Thanks, guys, for covering for me. One of the things I might just add to, I think, to Jeffrey, to your point about incorporation often being like a marriage, one of the compliance matters that I've experienced that can make that complicated is many African countries, not all, but many, have local director requirements. So if you want to create an entity in that country, you can't just have your founders, directors from whatever country you're based in. You have to find someone in that country that you trust a lot to be a director on paper to create the company, but also sometimes then also to help you create bank accounts or to register with statutory bodies and perform other critical and highly risky operations. So that's something that I think for foreign companies seeking remote teams in an African country, that can just be a deal breaker.
Yeah,
how to find those people.
And to layer on top of that, just again, maybe sophomoric for a lot of the executives here, but bear in mind that those directors carry full legal and fiscal risk and authority in those jurisdictions. So to your point, Boris, you not only need to trust them, they're on the line. So if you're doing stuff that's not compliant, they're completely culpable in many respects. And that's another place where employer of record mitigates a bunch of risk. It's also the things that keep Boris and Tracy frosty and a little sleepless at times, because you're managing that line. But it's definitely a value prop that's been proven to assist the clients as well as empower the employees in markets where they wouldn't normally be able to penetrate. Because Boris, you're right. A lot of companies are not going to come in and establish a legal presence and then find a local director and then open a bank account and go through all the back office finance, accounting, and tax setup and all the compliance and all the stuff there to hire 1, 2, 3, 5 people. Right. So what the employer of record model has done is it's blown those doors open and empowered a lot of companies to enter Africa at speed and in force in a compliant fashion, but in ways and in fashions that they normally wouldn't have. It's really exciting because there's a lot of social good that happens from it. There's a lot of employee experience. It's much more positive. The clients are coming in knowing that their risk is mitigated and they're compliant from a legal and finance perspective, as well as ready for an exit. It's pretty much a win-win for both parties across the board. It's a very exciting time.
Absolutely. Well, maybe just last question then. WorkPay is first and foremost a tech company. So one of the things we're most interested in is how does tech broadly solve challenges of, hiring, managing, compensating, appreciating employees across the continent. And EOR is one of the ways in which we do that. EOR has existed long before WorkPay's software, but one of our strategic goals for this year is to expand our software to address some of these challenges, right? Increasingly kind of automate some of this stuff so that the EOR service that we provide is optimized and backed by really nice, easy to use technology. Can you guys talk about what you've seen, and maybe just start with you, Jeff, how has technology in the EOR space evolved to this point, and what do you see as the key kind of future evolutions of and the role of tech in EOR to perhaps further enhance the value proposition of that service?
It's evolved radically in the last 5-10 years. I mean, you've got human capital management platforms, you have automated payroll platforms, you have expense platforms, you have PTO or time and attendance platforms. You have all kinds of technological tools that have streamlined the process, both from an employee and a client and an EOR perspective, not to mention the things that Tracy's talking about on the backside about governments requiring electronic filings and compliance in that respect too. So the technology is evolving on all fronts, and it's really exciting because it really streamlines the process in a lot of ways. I would say, not to throw shade on your parade here, but there's a marriage there. Having technology is fantastic. All right. It definitely automates things, it simplifies things, keeps people honest. But you always need to have that service delivery platform underneath the technology, because technology is great until things start to burn. And then when things start to burn, you need people, you need competent attorneys, you need a competent structure, you need an environment where things have been set up properly. So I think it's a marriage again between the two. But yeah, there's the evolution of technology in the EOR space has been fast and rampant, and it's fed by things that are feeding into it too. I mean, The HCM space has evolved a lot. The payroll space itself has evolved a lot. Time and attendance, expense management, all those tools have evolved both in the free market as well as the EOR space. And it's how you incorporate that that's important. So, sorry. Tracy, anything?
Yeah, something else I'd probably add is contract automation, where self-onboarding has been made very simple and very short. So we're looking at the turnaround time for contract automations, and the only pushback sometimes would be probably different clauses here and there, but not the entirety of it. Something else I think I would say is adopting virtual compliance tools. Are able to do monitoring, training, and different compliance processes using those tools. So those are the two I would add onto that.
Thanks, guys. Well, we're at the 1 hour mark of our allocated time. So let me transition to some audience questions. We've got 3 here now. Feel free to add more. Those of you who have questions on your mind, if there's any you didn't understand, want clarified, want us to go a little bit deeper, or perhaps that we failed to address, please put that into the Q&A. You can click the little question mark, I believe, at the bottom of your screen. I will ask the first one, though I don't know what it means. So I hope that Jeffrey or Tracy, one of you understand what this means. But the question from Fawaz is global handshake a common practice in Africa during terminations? I don't know what that phrase means. Does that have meaning to either of you?
I'm not familiar with that. I'd have to guess. Tracy, is that a term you're used to?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay. Maybe I can ask. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
do you want to just make up what it means?
No, I'm happy to answer the question, but I need to more fully understand what you're asking.
Yeah. Maybe I can just ask Fawaz to clarify and maybe explain what that term means, and then we'll be in a better position to address it. There was another question to please advise on best practices that would help companies hiring globally to remain compliant. I don't know if there's anything that you guys feel we didn't touch on there. I mean, I guess the question is globally, not just Africa specific. Are there any best practices that you feel we've not covered?
There's some things to be aware of as you enter the global market, at least from an American and European perspective. I can speak a little bit to that. It's employee experience, it's parity, it's understanding your compliance risk from a global perspective, understanding what your business plan is and where your market entry is and where it makes sense. It's just, utilizing the tools you have from either your employer of record, your internal legal and HR and finance departments, as well as your external counsel, to make sure that you're doing this correctly and using the right tools for the job. I mean, in short, that's the answer. Tracy, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say it just covers from end. I think I'll just add like proper employment documentation. So where we have legal contracts, clear terms outlining the different benefits. Yeah, that would be key. That's the one I would point out at this time.
Okay, great. So Fawaz said global handshake means an agreement between employer and employee in terms of compensation.
Yeah, I'll speak to that because I don't know if Tracy's going to want to talk to that directly, but a global handshake sounds to me like a verbal contract, and that's going to be country by country. That's going to be very nebulous and unenforceable. So where it might be a thing, it's not something that I would advise. I would always advise writing things down because people change their mind, they change their story. So, that's kind of an old school way of doing it. Is it still applicable? That's a personal and business decision that you're going to have to make on your own. It's not going to really provide you any kind of enforceability or surety because there's really no documentation to back it up. So yeah, if that answers your question, Fawaz, great. If not, then feel free to pop more in there.
Yeah, I would certainly say that when it comes to labor law, at least in Kenya, like what you have said has, I've seen it have very little bearing when things go to court, but what you have written, certainly in a contract, but even in emails. So if you have a performance related termination or a disciplinary related termination, or even a redundancy, what really kind of makes or breaks you, whether you're an employer or an employee, is what has been put down in writing in terms of, you know, how the court's going to assess your compliance with different expectations. So personally, from work-based perspective as an employer and having run other companies here in Kenya, I would never rely on any kind of verbal contract. And I am big on kind of like over emphasizing the need to write down, and you know, if you have a conversation in person about performance, that you then document it via email and sort of a performance plan, or something to that effect. And I've gone through a couple redundancies, and you know, there's a lot of requirements around who you're issuing letters to, whether that letter is then going to the local labor office and the local chief to be stamped, whether you're communicating the expectation that you might do a redundancy to everyone or to certain teams, depending on the nature of that redundancy. There's a lot of box to tick, and they're all related to writing things down. And if you miss a tick or two, you're in trouble. And there's a couple startups recently in Kenya and Dar es Salaam that have, there's one, I don't want to like throw any names around, but they're in the news, startups that have gone through some major redundancies, and are having them challenged by employees who feel that they didn't follow the process, and it's coming down to, you know, what they wrote down and what they sent when. Another question we've had, which I'll direct to Tracy because it relates to Kenyan immigration, and Tracy handles most of our EOR related immigration matters, and of course is the Kenyan lawyer on the panel. So in a case where a foreign employer would like their employee to work remotely in Kenya for a 2-month period, would it be advisable to go down the EOR route, or to have the employee use their 2-month business visa to work? What are the risks in such an arrangement? So a foreign employee, presumably of a foreign entity, coming to Kenya for 2 months of business. Does EOR make sense versus getting a business visa, Tracy?
At that point, I would say no need for EOR, because that's just within the 60 days, the 60-day mark. So there will be no need really for that to arise, and that's why they would be able to use their special pass. However, after 90 days, then we would recommend them having to get onto an EOR company or a service provider, and then have an easy transition into employment, because then that will start raising tax obligations on their end. As long as they're working for gain and profit in Kenya, the government expects you to oblige in terms of your taxes. So within the 2-3 month mark, you can get away with it, but we recommend after the 3rd mark, after 90 days, then you better to get on with your service provider. And then you can also position your paperwork.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because it goes back to what we're talking about here, is the benefits of EOR, going into a country with the end in mind, knowing kind of what your brackets are. If you're going to be in and out in 2 months, like she said, then great. But is that really going to be the case? Because we all know that 1 month turns into 3 months really quickly, and 2 months is tap dancing, you know. So if you're certain you're going to wrap your project in 60 days, then you should be fine. But is that really the case? You know, that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I'm glad to have an immigration question, because that's not something we've touched on a lot. But obviously, as a foreigner living in Kenya, I have a lot of personal experience with that. And yeah, it is indeed a tricky balance, because I mean, as a general matter, if you're coming for short-term work, certainly most countries, most East African countries and most African countries have a business visa that allows for that, right? To come in as a foreigner working for a foreign entity, come do business for 1, 2, 3 months, and then leave. So you're not, you know, dealing with the risks that we've highlighted of permanent establishment and everything that comes with that. But if you're coming for a longer period, you do, and you kind of have to, you know, you have to figure out, based on the country that you're going to, what is the line, because the process of getting a work visa in most countries is measured certainly in months. And I found Kenya to be one of the most efficient, and it still takes 3 months There are other countries where it can take 4, 5, 6 or more months to have your work permit. And sometimes there are allowances. So they're saying if you've submitted an application and you confirm that you are going through the process of getting a work visa, then you can still be here and work. Others don't allow that, like Kenya doesn't allow that, for instance. So the immigration laws vary widely, the processes vary widely. The levels to the extent to which those processes are followed above board, I will say, are vary wildly as well. So that's a whole nother area of law that is complicated and that most EOR providers deal with for you, either directly or through, in our case, we maintain, because it's so varied, we have a network of partners, immigration specialists, immigration legal firms or consultancies in the different countries who handle that for us and are experts on the ground. And these processes can be super, super manual, where you have to go to the office, you have to push paper, shake hands, be there, kind of verbally advocate for yourself and your application. And so you need a local person with local expertise and local friendships within that government body, frankly, to kind of move it forward. And we maintain that network. But for a foreign company, it takes a long time to build that and have those kind of trusted relationships in the country. So EOR definitely makes sense if you have these immigration challenges, if you're going to be somewhere for, say, more than like 6 months. But again, what that time threshold is varies widely by country.
Yeah, and to level for this particular question from this individual, that's the time you can use. So if you're in Kenya for 2 months working and you know that you're going to be there for an extended period of time, you should be using that to, work with your employer of record and your master employer, your client, if you will, the managing employer, to find out, am I really going to be here longer? Are we using this time properly? Let's start a conversation with, myself or Catherine or whoever sooner than later to kind of figure this out and make sure we're using the time properly, as opposing to backing into a fire drill, right? So I think that's a better question for the Kenya person is, like I said, are you really going to be there for 2 months, or are you going to end up staying? Because if you are, put that 2 months to work and start the process, and save everybody a bunch of hassle. Look at them all. We're all trying not to laugh and smile because we've all been through these fire drills. I have one right now. We were talking about before this event. So, they happen. So plan ahead,
Yeah. So I think we've launched a poll during this question period. So the question's coming back at you attendees. You should have received a poll. There's a couple different questions you can respond to. If you haven't already, please respond to those. And then somehow Jess will behind the scenes show us the results. I believe there are 2 questions. The first one is, have you worked with an EOR before? Yes, no, or seeking. Sounds like the old Facebook status. Are you in a relationship with an EOR? It's complicated. And then the second question is, was your experience positive? 1 through 10, and feel free to have comments. Wow, and I can see that we have WorkPay clients on this call, so we're opening ourselves up here. I hope we get good feedback. And once those poll results are up, we'll be happy to discuss them. Jess, do we have the results in yet? There's another question I didn't get to.
That's okay. Let's take a look at the poll.
So,
I'm just pushing the result button. Let's see what it does.
I see. There it is.
Okay.
Oh, how would you rate this webinar?
Oh, we got a 50-50 on 4 stars and 5 stars. Thank you. You are too kind. And let's see.
So have you worked with EOR before? 22% yes, 66% no, 11% seeking. So we've got 3/4 of the audience has not or not yet utilized EOR services. So that's great. That's good to know. I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure how many of our respective kind of clients were here, people who have experience with EOR. So I hope we've been able to elaborate on where EOR fits in this big complicated question of managing compliance for remote teams for that 77%. And maybe right at the end, we'll also share some contacts for everybody here, so they can get in touch with us if you have questions, for those of you who are seeking, who are EOR curious.
I would love to
Yeah.
the audience to use the Q&A chat window to pop in reasons why you may not have used EOR. If you have a reason that you haven't, is there a reason? I'd love you to hear your feedback on your thoughts, feelings, trepidations, etc. Just haven't had the opportunity, etc. We'd love to hear your thoughts there.
And then while we wait for those to come in, the last poll question was your experience positive? For the minority of participants, or getting more responses coming in. So 23% of respondents have used EOR. So for those folks, was your experience positive? Most people 10 stars, 9 out of 19, 10 stars. And then the other roughly half of respondents are in the 7, 8, or 9 category. So sounds like no supremely negative responses. And maybe just to add on to what I suggested of putting in the Q&A, for those of you who have had a positive experience, maybe you can just elaborate on that. Like, in what way did you feel like you got value? Because like all services, you're paying for it, right? So your overall kind of outlay for setting up this remote team becomes larger. I think in the long run, it saves you a huge amount of money because you're not setting up your entity. But you could be paying sort of a 10% or more multiplier on, a particular employee's salary. So how do you feel you got that value back? Like, what was the ROI? I think that would be helpful to hear if anyone wants to put that into the Q&A. Maybe in the meantime,
there's an interesting question that came in here, and I would recommend that this person just reach out to Catherine, because these are very specific questions that we can't really answer without more information, and are not going to answer in public, because there's a lot of nuance here. But the questions being, what are the requirements for a work permit, working in other Eastern African countries, and when a company opens a branch, etc., what are the ramifications there? Very happy to answer those questions directly. I imagine Catherine would be more than happy to get into the weeds with you on that. Unless you guys want to get into it now, but there's a lot there, and we don't have the time.
There is a lot there. I'll just say from the WorkPay side, whatever those requirements are for Kenyans working in another East African country. I mean, those requirements differ, right? Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, certainly Ethiopia. The requirements vary widely, but we are familiar with them. We have immigration partners in all of those places, and so we can help you identify and manage those requirements. And then in terms of running payroll in those countries, with both local and expat hires, our core product is a payroll engine that's meant to simplify this across border in Africa. So we would, in an EOR context, manage that payroll, and whether they be foreign or local hires, we'd be able to pay them compliantly in an EOR relationship. So Felicity, please reach out. Maybe Catherine, you can just share verbally and in the Q&A, like what are the contacts for people to use? And Jeffrey, do you want to do the same from your side?
Yeah, because I was going to say the question there too, Felicity, is, if they're establishing, opens a branch or whatnot, doing payroll on a client's entity versus doing payroll from an EOR perspective are actually, while they sound similar, they're entirely different animals. So that's another part of the conversation that we can drill down into, because this is what we were getting at as far as like entity and employee life cycle, understanding your tools, understanding where the brackets and boundaries are. And that's a very specific conversation that we can have with you.
Absolutely. And we have both, while Catherine oversees the global remote payroll, we do outsourced payroll for local companies. So if you have a locally established branch, you can outsource that payroll to us entirely, or you can self-manage your own payroll compliantly through our through our software platform, where we just pay a small fee per employee to run, process, and then pay out the payroll every month. So yeah, but it would certainly depend on what that kind of legal setup looks like. All right, we haven't got too much insight on people's EOR experience. I think we've got a little over 5 minutes left. So maybe what I'll do now is just hand it over to Catherine. Just see if you want to make any sort of closing remarks in regards to the discussion today. Any key takeaways from your perspective, having been in this industry for a long, long time? Yeah, your insights, and then and any kind of next steps that you'd recommend people take for those at least who are EOR curious.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Boris. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on wherever you are. So this webinar has been highly informative, and we've heard a lot from the legal advisor, now Jeff, on managing compliance risks for remote teams across Africa. It has been incredibly relevant, given the increasing shift to remote work, especially in our region. And recapping is the hardest because it's been definitely packed. And we've discussed various compliance risks that remote teams face. And you heard Tracy talk about data security issues, adherence to local and international regulatory requirements. I think one of the things that I have picked out are the practical solutions that the speakers or the panelists have given to some of the challenges. Boris spoke about staying updated. No, Jeff spoke about staying updated with global compliance. I tried writing notes and regulatory changes. And we also had insightful case studies that they illustrated. And this was by Jeff and Tracy on the real world applications of these solutions. And they also spoke about several tools and resources designed to help manage the compliance risks. My key takeaways from this, and this was mentioned by Boris, is the necessity for clear communication channels and just really over documenting and just making sure that you have either supported, especially when it comes to the end of the contract or when you are parting ways, and just having the right information to support your company at that point in time, and the need for continuous monitoring and assessment of compliance practices. That is something that Tracy mentioned. And one thing I'd like to say, and this this is very deeply, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers. The marketing team really did great arranging this webinar. Your efforts in bringing together knowledgeable speakers and creating a platform for this essential discussion are greatly, greatly appreciated. And then a heartfelt thank you to the panelists for sharing their experience and their expertise and insights. Your contributions have provided us with a deeper understanding on how to manage the compliance risks and effectively, managing a remote work environment. To all the participants, thank you for your active engagement and thoughtful questions. I know if we had more time, there would be more questions flowing in. So your participation has definitely enriched the discussion and added significant value to the webinar. I'd also like to encourage everyone to apply the strategies and best practices discussed today. Let's continue to stay informed and proactive in managing compliance risks. I know our head of marketing, Jess, has left lots of emails on the chat box. I hope you're doing that, Jess. I know one of the emails you should be reaching out to is remote@myworkday.com if you haven't already. Also, all the panelists here have LinkedIn handles. If you can reach out to that, please feel free to do so. Drop emails to, if you have an urgent need, to the emails on the chat box that Jess has dropped there. Thank you all once again, and I wish you all success in implementing these strategies within your teams. And please feel free to check out, keep an eye for upcoming events and see what the marketing team will be putting out in all these webinars that she has throughout the year, and any other resources that they share on the WorkPay page that can further aid this journey. Thank you and have a great day.
Indeed. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you. Big thanks, especially, I think, to Jeffrey for joining all these WorkPay people and providing all their insights. It's been fantastic. And to Tracy, who stepped in last minute and crushed it. I don't know if this is your first webinar, Tracy, but I think you had some really valuable insights, and we appreciate it. And likewise, Jeffrey. So thank you both.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jess, for organizing, and thanks for all the attendees for sticking with us. We appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank
Jeff
you very
has
much.
something to say.
No, I just said this is exactly what partnership means, right? This is the second word and the most important word in my job title, which is partnership. And this is how we support each other. So happy to do so. Not a problem. Look forward to doing it more in the future.
Fantastic. All right. Well, good night from Kenya. Have a great day if you're somewhere where it's earlier in the world.
Oh, another question. Sorry, something I didn't mention. I just got this from marketing right now. There will be a follow-up webinar in August as part of a webinar series, and they'd love to know what are the EOR topics you'd like to hear from us. So please keep that information coming. I'm sure she's provided all the links and the possible emails that you should write that to. Thanks once again.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.